Lighting can be one of the most enhancing or distracting elements in our worship services. So in this video, I want to show you how we leverage lighting to create aesthetically pleasing, excellent looks without having our volunteers get bogged down in the weeds of programming, really keeping it simple but getting excellent results. The first tip is to stay organized. Now, whether you're using LightKey like I am here at our church or any other software-based programming solution for your lighting, you'll want to make sure you're organized so that you can find what you're looking for. This means that you have every parameter of every light in a specific place and easy to find whenever you need it. For example, let me show you what our old LightKey setup used to look like. Now, this LightKey setup was disorganized. Fixtures were everywhere. Nobody really knew where things were saved. Folders were named in very strange ways, and the display didn't even reflect what was actually in the room. Everything was kind of grouped together in a weird way, and so we really couldn't find what we were looking for if it came to troubleshooting or programming for the weekend. Now here, let me show you our new and improved LightKey show file. This LightKey show file has a bunch of folders, but the primary one is called Fixtures. And in that folder of fixtures, you can see that we have every fixture as its own folder. And then within that folder, each fixture has its own set of parameters, and each parameter has its own folder, so that if I want to tweak the dimmer or the intensity of one type of light, I know exactly where to find that preset that I've programmed based on what our Sunday services require. So that means if I want our house lights at 100, I know to go to our house lights folder, and then I go to our dimmer settings and I grab that 100% and I drag that onto a queue and it's ready to go. But let's say I wanted to do 45%. Rather than tweaking or saving a bunch of random presets in different places, I want to make sure I save that preset into the dimmer folder of the house lights fixture folder. So that makes it super easy to find what we're looking for when we're thinking about designing looks for our Sunday services. I can go right to the folder that takes me to the parameter of that fixture and tweak and adjust to my heart's content. We also updated our preview window or our display view of the actual stage layout and configuration so that when you're looking at the stage in the room, you're also seeing a corresponding graphic layout on LightKey's software. So that means that when I click on a light over towards the left of the preview window, I'm actually going to be adjusting the light that's on the left of the stage. This makes it way easier for our volunteers to get where they need to go quickly and efficiently to adjust the lighting looks that we use during our weekend services. The second pro tip is to use templates if at all possible. Now, LightKey specifically doesn't have a template feature, but what it does have is the ability to duplicate live pages, whether you're using a control panel with the queue buttons or using the queue lists in a sequential order through your services. Now, what I've done is I've created a service flow that follows our planning center order of service. In that order of service, I'll make buttons per the item in the service flow. So we have a pre-service button, we have song 1 and song 2, we have a welcome, we have a sermon look, we have an announcement button, and I just make buttons with each of those elements, and then I program lights into those buttons accordingly. That means that I can create a service flow in LightKey with the buttons in the control panel view, and then I can duplicate that setup of control buttons and use that as a template. So I've created one that is our standard service flow. Here at Storyline, we really follow a very similar service flow week in and week out. We might add some variety for a child dedication or a baptism or a video, something that comes along kind of here and there, but most of the time we have a very consistent service flow week in and week out. And so I've just made the buttons of our service flow with the appropriate titles and names, and then I've saved that as my Storyline template. And now each week, all I do is I go in and I duplicate that template. What these templates allow me to do is save the looks that I know I want to be consistent. For example, our pre-service in the room look as people walk in, I want the house lights to be at a certain intensity, and I also want our gobos and our profile fixtures to be doing certain things to add texture to the room, and our haze to be at a certain level. So I can put all of that on my button for my Storyline template. And then week in and week out, when I duplicate that, I know that all of those settings stay consistent throughout, especially with things like our key light and our front wash for our sermon and for our musical portion. I want that key light to not have to be adjusted every single week. I want it to stay really simple. I want it to stay really consistent so that one week you're not seeing somebody's skin looking more green than others. I want it to stay at the same color temperature and the same intensity throughout and in the same positions. When I save all my key light and my front wash settings into these control panel buttons, this allows me to duplicate this, knowing that every week my songs are going to look very similar. They're going to really vary in the color and the creative elements I use, but the front wash and skin tones will remain very consistent. Obviously, it's very easy to tweak if I need to by going into my preset palette and adjusting minor things like position or color temperature, but for the most part, I duplicate these settings and can leave them untouched from week to week and simply adjust the creative elements of our lighting design. Pro tip number 3 is to use the effect parameter within Light Key so you don't overhaze the room. Now, this was something I was guilty of when I came on board at Storyline. I came on board and there was a button for haze in the control panel view of Light Key, and that button was an on-off button. And if you've ever run haze before, you know how dangerous an on-off button can be if left unattended. So we would have volunteers or myself come in and trigger the button, and it would run for sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes 30 seconds, and depending on the week and who was running it, it would be totally different amounts of haze in the room, which was super distracting. Some weeks there were no haze and you couldn't really see the beams of light and it wouldn't really enhance the atmosphere at all. Other weeks there'd be so much haze that you really couldn't even see the pastor on stage because there was such a thick cloud of haze sitting up on stage. And that was really frustrating to me until I found out that you could use the effect parameters on Light Key. So I'm going to show you how we operate it now in Light Key, where in our preset palette, I've created a folder called Haze. And in that folder of Haze, I have 100%, I have a song effect, and I have a pre-service effect. These are really the 3 that I find myself needing most often. But what the song effect does, for example, is I have a basic sine wave that goes up and down and up and down. And what I've triggered is a 20% release of that haze. So I set the intensity of the actual hazer within Light Key to 20. And so at max, it's gonna put out, it's not gonna pump out a bunch of haze all at once like 100%. It's gonna stick at that 20%, so it's not really pushing out that much. And then I'm adding an effect that actually acts as a dimmer level where it goes up and down in terms of intensity. And I have it peaking at around 40% to where it'll gradually go up to 40% intensity and then it will drop back down to 0. And keeping in mind that the max it's gonna pump out is 20% of the haze. And so it's gonna gradually go up, pushing out 20% of haze, gradually fade down, come down to 0, and it's just gonna do that real lightly throughout the songs. So I drag that preset onto our songs, and that means that there's a very slow drip of haze coming out through our songs so that nobody's ever seeing a big puff of smoke or a big spew of haze coming out from the hazer or the right corner of our stage, and it's just kind of slowly trickling and you barely ever see it, and it adds a nice little atmospheric effect to the room with the beams of light that just all of a sudden you're seeing these beams really clearly. So this prevents my volunteers from having to worry about it. Again, going back to our pro tip number 2 with using templates, is I put this haze effect for the songs at 20% onto all of our song buttons in the control panel view. I also put our pre-service haze effect onto our pre-service button in control panel so that we can click the control panel and know that it'll drip about 5% because that pre-service button might be on much longer during some weeks, and so you want that to be a really minimal drip of haze, but that over time it actually kind of fills up the room really nice. But it's never adding big puffs of haze into the room. It's just a slow drip over time that incrementally adds a nice little look as we begin our services. This also means that I don't have to worry about accidentally forgetting to turn it off or relying on somebody to cancel the haze, because if I use that template and I make sure that the sermon button in my control panel or the bumper video in the control panel doesn't have the haze effect, I know that the haze machine will stop and it won't be pumping out haze during that moment. So that's pro tip number 3. Use effect parameters within your lighting software to control the amount of haze so that you have consistent lighting looks every single time. Pro tip number 4 is to match lighting looks to your worship backgrounds. Here at Storyline, we subscribe to Church Motion Graphics, so every couple months I'll go in and grab a couple new backgrounds and things that I find aesthetically pleasing and not distracting distracting, whether that be a nature look with some flyover drone footage, or it might be some kind of ambiguous or vague shape with some color in the background, and it looks great on our LED wall. And then I take those colors and I build lighting looks around those colors. So what I've done, and I'm going to show you a walkthrough of how I do this here in Lightkey, I make a folder in my preset palette called Motion Background Presets. And then when I'm designing lighting looks, I just pull up the motion background for that song, and I'll look at the name or the label that Church Motion Graphics gives us. Sometimes that's a number, other times that's a kind of a quirky name. And I'll take that name and save it as a preset as I design my lighting look. So I'll grab our grid lights, or the lights that are hanging above our stage on our lighting grid, and I'll use those for color enhancement. And so I'll really take those lights and create nice color combos and layouts that really kind of marry the Church Motion graphic background color, and then that feels like one unified look. Rather than kind of guess at what looks good and kind of wonder what we're going for, I've told all of our volunteers that what we're trying to do is make the whole stage feel like one designed theme. And so we use the colors from Church Motion backgrounds and those motion backgrounds that we use to steer us in the right direction of color and color combinations in Lightkey as we program our looks. Once we've got a good look, we save that as a preset in accordance with the background name. And then week in and week out, depending on what backgrounds we use, I can just click and drag that background preset with the right name to coordinate with it onto the button for that week. And then in my control panel, I've done minimal programming, I've done minimal editing because I've got my wash and all the things from my template already created. Then all I'm doing is adding colors, and as I build out this list of Church Motion background presets that correspond with those, I can very, very quickly drag and drop those presets week in and week out as we reuse backgrounds that we find that we enjoy and are aesthetically pleasing to us. So programming on a Sunday morning now really only takes 5 or 10 minutes. You pull up each motion background that you're going to be using for the songs, and you go to the folder of motion background presets, and you just create those presets by really creating those color combinations on the grid of lights here at Storyline. And that means that I don't have to edit any kind of stage wash, I don't have to edit any kind of key light, they can all stay consistent with our template. So that's pro tip number 4, is to match your color combinations in your lighting software with your motion backgrounds to create a unified look. Pro tip number 5 is to leverage automation with things like ProPresenter or a Stream Deck to trigger your lighting looks. I know a lot of us in tech ministry are running on leaner teams these days, and sometimes it's hard when people call out or they can't come and serve on the weekend, and sometimes it's not really necessary to have them sit there for the whole service, triggering only a few lighting looks. So leveraging something like ProPresenter and MIDI commands and something like a Stream Deck could be really useful for you. I know that I have Stream Decks at every position in our tech ministry. So I've got one at our lighting computer, I've got one at front of house, I've got one up in our broadcast booth, so that any week, if somebody doesn't show up to run lights, I can program those MIDI buttons to either be triggered via the ProPresenter computer or via the Stream Deck. That means that a volunteer could sit down, I could grab somebody from the lobby, they could come sit down, and I could have just the buttons that they need to click in the order that they need to trigger them in, and they would be executed right then and there. I find here at Storyline that it's much easier to trigger with ProPresenter, because then when the volunteer who's running ProPresenter is triggering our background for the song or the next graphic in the sermon slides, that is what's triggering the Lightkey computer. So like I mentioned back before, I leverage the template to follow our Planning Center service flow. And so that means that we've got a couple songs, we've got announcements, we've got a sermon, and then we've got maybe a response song at the end, and potentially a bumper video in there somewhere in between. And what I have triggered in ProPresenter is I have a MIDI macro on the ProPresenter backgrounds for the songs, for the sermon, and for announcements, and for the sermon bumper video that will trigger and correspond with the appropriate control panel button in Lightkey. That way, when the ProPresenter operator is going through the motions on a Sunday morning, they're not doing anything different than they would normally do. but that macro is triggering our lighting computer so that it's triggering the lights right at the exact time. We don't have any need for a countdown or somebody calling cues or anything like that. That one computer is doing both jobs. And obviously you could do it from the same computer if you wanted to, but in our circumstance, we've got two separate stations, and so we leverage the BOEM network for MIDI coordination, and that allows us to trigger across our network. So that is pro tip number 5. Leverage MIDI automation with programs like ProPresenter and the Elgato Stream Deck so that you can trigger your lighting looks seamlessly, flawlessly, and at the right time every time. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this video of 5 pro tips to help leverage lighting in your worship and tech ministry. If you want a full, comprehensive, step-by-step how-to guide on how to program LightKey, but also how to leverage 3-point lighting design and understand lighting philosophy and color and all the important things about lighting, we have got a great course in Worship Ministry School called Lighting for Worship. This will walk through a very practical application of how to leverage lighting in your unique context with whatever fixtures you have. This is specifically written for people in church ministry, so we're not talking about programming rock shows, and we're not talking about big concert venues. We're really talking to those of you in a church context. So if you want to learn how I program LightKey and see a step-by-step video walkthrough of that process and how I organized it, you can check out worshipministryschool.com to click the apply button and get started today. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you again next time.